I have tried to save a good, juicy story for the last of our Bible stories the preacher never told you, and this is certainly a good one. And I have to admit, I have a lot of questions about this story and why it happens the way it does. I don't understand why certain people act in certain ways, and so let's explore this a little bit together. What strikes me, however, is, have any of you ever watched the What Would You Do show on ABC? It's a news program, and they set up a situation with actors where they try to make it look like someone's acting racist or in a public place or do something that is really wrong that people should speak out about. This to me is the sort of What Would You Do story of the Bible, because Jael is just a bystander. She shouldn't have a dog in this fight. But what she does is pretty dramatic. Now, the background is fairly simple. The story takes place during the time of the judges. We talked about it a few weeks ago when we explored that nice little story about Ehud killing fat King Eglon, the left-handed hero. And we talked about how there's this pattern in Judges where the Israelites frequently fell into, where they started out faithful to God, God blessed them, then they started to wander from God, and God brought judgment down upon them, and then they cried out to God for help. And this just happened over and over again. This is just one chapter later from that last story. And after the episode where Israel was delivered from King Ehud, in the story we heard 2 weeks ago, they had 80 years of peace before they started to turn away from God again. And this time they've been persecuted by this general named Sisera. Now, when I call him a general, that is really giving him more credit than he deserves, because a general is somebody who's worthy of respect, and Sisera is more like a warlord. This isn't Patton. It's not. It isn't MacArthur or Norman Schwarzkopf or George Washington. This is a warlord, a person who uses power to get what he wants. So the same thing has happened. The Israelites have called out to God for help. They have just fought a battle against the Canaanites, and thanks to the help of God, they were victorious. In fact, really the great hero that we didn't read about, and that you should go home and read about in this story, is another woman, a prophetess named Deborah. I'm sure I will preach about her sooner or later, but for now, one thing I would say is, first, go home this afternoon and read about Deborah and the role that she plays, and then read the following chapter, I believe it's chapter 5, and read the Song of Deborah, because it's this dramatic retelling of the whole episode in poetic form, and it's beautiful. And Deborah has an extraordinary story as well. Well, after the Canaanites flee, including this great general Sisera, in fact, he's the last one left, Sisera seems to be a fairly well-known warlord in the region. Everyone's afraid of him. But when he sees that his army is about to be routed in battle with Israel, he runs as fast as he can to the nearest hiding place he can find, which, Sisera is on the run, hoping to get away from the advancing Israelites, when he happens upon this tent of a nomad sheep-herding family. Near the tent is the wife of the family, a woman named Jael, and quickly Sisera runs to her for help. So now let's see what happens next in the story with our modern Bible flannel graph retelling of the story, like we did in children's Sunday school years ago. Let's roll that beautiful bean footage and see what happens in the story next.
And said unto him, Turn in, my Lord, turn in to me, fear not. And when he had turned in unto her into the tent, she covered him with a mantle. And he said unto her, Give me, I pray thee, a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. And she opened a bottle of milk, and gave him drink, and covered him. Again he said unto her, Stand in the door of the tent, and it shall be, when any man doth come and inquire of thee, and say, Is there any man here? that thou shalt say, No. Then Jael Heber's wife took a nail of the tent, and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail into his temples, and fastened him into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died. Judges 4, 18 to 21.
And once again, we all laugh at the strangest things. You know, as I see this story unfold, I think about it, and my first thought is to, there are those branches of the church that are afraid of strong, independent women, that think women should be silent and at home. And my first thought is they may not want to do that because a woman who is kind of quiet and in her home can still be a pretty dangerous woman. And maybe they need to read the story of Jael, and they certainly need to read the story of Deborah as well. In fact, both Deborah and Jael are great examples of women in the Bible who are comfortable doing anything, who are comfortable being leaders, and apparently the people around them are comfortable with their role in that way as well. Maybe the Bible has a few good stories to tell, in fact, about women who know how to take charge and how God's purposes were realized through those women. Now, as Sisera flees, he gets to the nomad's tent. Jael is the husband of a man named Heber. We don't know why Heber isn't there, but apparently he's not. He's a shepherd. It's not unreasonable to assume that he is out with the flock. And Sisera recognizes that Jael and her husband are Kenites, which is important for two reasons. First of all, it means that they are not part of any of the tribes of Israel. They're not Israelites. They were outsiders who lived in the area of Israel nomadically, but they were a community apart. Second, the Bible tells us that the Kenites were at peace with Sisera and with his king and with his people, the Canaanites. In other words, Sisera assumes that this is going to be a safe refuge for him. Jael shouldn't be any concern for him. In fact, this is the part of the story that really perplexes me a little bit. Why does she kill Sisera? I mean, it's good for God's purposes, but what exactly is she doing? Why exactly is she doing this? Is she secretly a God worshiper? Is she sympathetic to the Israelites in the way that they have been oppressed by Sisera? Is she just a serial killer? We don't know, and the story doesn't answer the question. I mean, there are things that are clear. This story is told to make it's told in this way to make Sisera look bad. This supposedly magnificent pagan general looks rather foolish. There are old stories about Sisera that he was a very large man. He was big and strong and mean. And yet, it's this outsider, it's this woman, it's this person that nobody in this story really expects much from, who kills him. Not some big, great warrior. This great figure of masculine leadership is taken down not through force of arms, but through clever manipulation. But why this non-Israelite? Why this outsider? We'll come back to that shortly. However, Sisera runs inside the tent hoping for a hiding place, and no sooner does he go inside than he forgets that he's a coward and he starts acting like a general again. And he starts bravely ordering Jael around. Give me a place to hide. Give me some water to drink. Stand by the door of the tent and say this and that. He seems to have forgotten that just a few minutes ago he was fleeing from the field of battle in shame. And even his orders have an air of irony and reveal what kind of coward he really is. Many Bible translations say that Sisera says let me start that over again. Sisera tells Jael that if anybody comes by and asks if anyone is in the tent to say no. What the Hebrew can also mean is there a man in the tent? Which obviously, the correct answer to that is no, because Sisera, according to the storyteller, really ought not consider himself to be a man. And for her part, Jael just quietly acts as though she's following orders, and she's very clever about it. He asks for a place to hide, so she says, lay down and cover yourself up. He asks for a glass of water. She gives him a nice warm glass of milk. She is lulling this guy to sleep. And This all seems innocent enough to Sisera, who seems awfully slow-witted to be a great general to me. He's all too happy to lay down and rest while his army is finishing being butchered on the field. And he glugs down the milk in a few gulps, and before you know it, Sisera really is asleep. And that's when Jael acts. She grabs a wooden tent peg and a mallet, and she places the peg at poor Sisera's temple, and well, we've seen the rest. There's a terrible crunching noise, and that's just about it. This may sound pretty brutal, but remember that Sisera is a terrible oppressor. This is the end that he probably does deserve. This great pagan general who has oppressed God's people and done great evil is disposed of. He doesn't die a noble death in the heat of battle. He isn't even killed by a weapon of war. He's killed with a peg, an everyday tool, and he isn't slain by a great hero. He's slain by Jael, an everyday kind of person. You know, there's another character that we have in this story. This story is all about how the everyday people are the ones that make the difference. And there's this other character. We don't read about him much in the story. We saw him right at the beginning. But the Israelites have a great and powerful general too. And his name is Barak. And if you read the first chapter, the first half of the chapter, you see that Barak, who should be the strong and courageous figure, is rather weak. And he's always afraid. Deborah, the prophetess, always has to arm twist him into doing the right thing, and even then he only does it half-heartedly. All of the brave, noble people in this story end up failing in leadership. It's the everyday people, the people on the bottom, who rise up, do the right thing. Barak is no hero and only does the right thing when Deborah forces him to. Jael, the average wife of a shepherd, does what Barak can't do. She's the one who kills the great hero in the fight. How often do we see the problems that plague our community, our nation, our world, our family, our church? And how often do we wish that the powers that be would do something about those problems? If this story tells us anything, it's that the true heroes and the true problem solvers usually do not come from the top. They're not the ones who are willing to take the risks. They are the ones who have something to lose. They don't come from the upper echelons of society or from the group, but from the people who are just sort of ordinary. Joan of Arc liberates France because the king is too weak to do so. Rosa Parks sparks a civil rights revolution because her feet are tired on the way home from work. With nothing but a glass of milk and some camping supplies, Jael rescues Israel from this terrible villain. Jael, the outsider, the one who isn't supposed to be part of God's family. And yet God seems pretty comfortable with her, and the Bible seems okay with labeling her a heroine. Great women and men, it seems, don't just show up on thrones and in places of importance, but in the most average places as well. Roy Blankenship was preparing his breakfast one summer morning. He lived in Andover, Ohio. And he gazed out the window and saw down at the bottom of his backyard was a culvert, a rain-flooded drainage ditch. And as he looked out, he saw a little girl who was trapped in the ditch and going downstream in the floodwaters. Now he knew that just a little further downstream, the ditch disappeared under a road and merged into a culvert, and the girl was not going to make it if she went down that far. So Ray dashed out the door, raced along the ditch, trying to get ahead of her, and then he dived into the deep, churning water, grabbing the girl's arm and emerging. The two tumbled end over end, and within 3 feet of the yawning culvert, Ray grabbed hold of something that felt firm in the water, probably a rock, and he just clung desperately as the tremendous force of the water tried to tear the child out of his arms. He later related that all he thought was that if he could just hold on long enough until the fire department arrived, that they would all be okay. Well, he did better than that. By the time the fire rescuers arrived, Blankenship had pulled the girl out onto the bank and to safety. Both were treated for shock, but the following month, Ray was awarded the Coast Guard's Silver Life-Saving Medal, a fitting award for Ray's selflessness. And it was especially fitting for Ray because it was not only an extraordinary risk that he took, but Ray Blankenship didn't know how to swim. Courage is a very strange thing. You see it in Jael, who took on quite a risk. But courage is not about an absence of fear. Courage is doing what you are afraid to do. There can be no courage unless you're scared. This very normal person thinks quickly and acts on her feet, and in the end, she wins the day. Remember that I mentioned the Song of Deborah, this beautiful piece of poetry about the event. It happens in the next, it's in the next chapter. Well, listen to how it describes Jael. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, the tent-dwelling people most blessed. He asked for water, she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hands to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. And she struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell. He lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Well, maybe that last part is a little bit morbid in its description. But most blessed of women be Jael. What extraordinary words for an everyday peasant shepherd's wife. In the name of God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.